Well, welcome everyone. My name is Beth Furnish. I'm a volunteer with the League of Women Voters in Stillwater. And our purpose this evening is to educate citizens about drawing district maps and meet the cartographer, Mark Owens, who recently drew district maps for our People Not Politicians Coalition. And our state legislature will be issuing district maps soon. About a year and a half ago, the League of Women Voters in Oklahoma, the Board of Trustees voted to become a coalition partner with People Not Politicians. People Not Politicians' goals match ours with the belief that politicians should not be drawing district lines. We believe that task should be given to a citizen-led commission where commissioners are selected from a pool of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And we are equally in favor of open meetings and public input. So together we pushed a redistricting initiative petition last year that survived 2 court challenges, but with COVID-19, we realized that getting enough petition signatures before the November election was unlikely, and the petition was put on the shelf for the time being. We are very happy that the legislature has sought public input. So tonight we will get to listen in on a conversation between Mark Owens and Andy Moore. Mark is an expert in the study of American politics and representation. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Georgia and is now an associate professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. He also has past experience working on Capitol Hill and providing data analysis for redistricting in multiple states. Andy Moore is executive director of 3 Oklahoma-based nonprofits, People Not Politicians, Let's Fix This, and Freedom of Information Oklahoma, which all play a role related to government transparency, civic engagement, and democracy reform. He's also an entrepreneur in residence at the OU Price College of Business and serves on the boards of Generation Citizen Oklahoma and Rank the Vote Oklahoma. So without further ado, we will listen to the conversation between Andy and Mark for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So if you have questions that come up, you can put them in the comments.
Thanks, Beth. I'm so glad to be here. Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Moore. I'm as she said, the director of People Not Politicians, and I'm excited to have a conversation with my friend Mark this evening. Mark and I have worked very closely over the last several months, getting to know all of the nuances of Oklahoma maps. Mark is, I will say from my personal experience, a very astute dude, which I think is the clinical term for this, but he has probably learned and forgotten more about maps in general in the abstract than I have learned over the last couple of years. But he has been so helpful in guiding us as we looked at the state legislative guidelines for public map submission, how we drew the maps and ultimately how we've submitted them. And now we get the chance to go back and look at how our maps compare to everybody else. Which is, this whole process has been like a really great exercise in democracy and a really fascinating experience. I know, at least for me, hopefully for many of you who I know have been following along the last couple of years. So tonight, Mark, let's maybe just have a conversation back and forth and talk about redistricting more in the abstract. We don't have to get into the Oklahoma specifics unless people have questions as we go along, but I thought it would be nice to kind of talk about how you as an expert approach this and maybe how we as citizens can think about the redistricting process and what all is involved in the process. So from there, maybe start us off with where you start and perhaps things we should think about when we approach the redistricting process. Oh, I think you're muted there.
Thank you, Andy. Beth as well. Thank you for introducing us, and it's great to join you all tonight. The way that I tend to think about this, I guess, as the teacher, is it always goes back to the history, right? Knowing, for me, it's following the redistricting and the rules that need to be followed, follow somewhat more a path of Supreme Court precedent, right? In this case, then relative to any kind of law that we necessarily have. So this does go back to like 1964, especially with this idea of the state legislature and Baker versus Carr, right? That you need to make sure that you couldn't just have a Senate based off of having one representative per county. This idea that we're going to move into the fact of one person, one vote. And that's really important here when we think of this beyond just the Westbury versus case that gets a lot more attention. Then in a lot of ways, what jumps to me though is through the 80s, right? The inclusion of multiple communities of interest that need to have coverage. This would include, right, Latinos and the idea of Spanish speaking communities. And then anytime that you have a large, say, Asian, or I'm not remembering in Texas, right, a Vietnamese population, then you're going to include that as well. So this gives us a sense that anytime one group of individuals is not a majority, but actually has the ability to live close and be in their own district, that needs to be observed. And then the court also told us that in the 1990s through Georgia, that cannot be the only reason why you draw a map. Because in Georgia, they had drawn a map that went from Atlanta all the way to Savannah, right? Connecting, really running along the highways and connecting one neighborhood in North Savannah to one neighborhood in South Atlanta. And that would really, to us, realize that while that's contiguous, it's all connected, and it's equal population, it's not compact, right? And so the issues that I think to us are common sense is that every part of your district needs to be connected to each other. Can't have them floating around. And then the other was for us that the equal population, but really this fairness starts to build itself off of compactness and the other idea of non-retrogression, so that everyone has the chance to represent someone.
Yeah. So I like that I think you hit the nail on the head, as one would expect. But talking about, well, for one, using the word fair maps, right, and drawing maps in a way that kind of just makes sense. And so I think, from my conversations with people across the state of Oklahoma, people think about districts that, we'll say, quote, make sense with ones that aren't weirdly shaped and stretched out or stretch along a highway. And we'll talk in a minute about how sometimes you end up with somewhat oddly shaped districts just because of other boundaries that already exist or other reasons that that actually do make sense. They just happen to look a little weird. But you, I think, alluded to both what we would commonly call packing and cracking, right? So packing would be putting voters of a certain type, in this case, like a race or ethnicity, into a very specific district and drawing a district to include only those voters or a strong majority. And then cracking would be dividing those communities between a bunch of different districts so as to dilute their vote. Am I correct in?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I think, at least maybe to jump ahead, the best way I think that we can avoid that is by, right, at least focusing in on keeping a community as compact or as contiguous and collective as possible. So if you have a city, right, that idea of, I think in a lot of ways of cracking is, don't cut the city down the middle, right? In this case, if that city is about the size of a state legislative district, right, draw the district around its city boundary. Because though they receive the same services, right, you can control it that way. They're going to vote and have the same, almost on the ladder of representation, a lot more overlap. As opposed to if 4 people start representing the same city that could otherwise have its own representation.
Sure. So beyond looking, well, first I would say, like, what are some other traits or boundaries you might find for those communities to help instruct where you draw the lines?
Yeah. The best for us, our finest grain, and really the tool of the trade is the census block. So if you wonder, why is my neighborhood split in between 2, it might just be because that was the line of the census block. There's nothing that we can go more below that. And in those census blocks, they're then in groups. And I think that's where Andy and I were working this time, is that's where we felt like the finest grain we could be, is a group of maybe 3 to 4 census blocks that, at least when I look at the one that I live in, that's actually a representation of my neighborhood, right? It's completely inside those 2 major roads that define my neighborhood. That's my census block group. And it extends all the way to the park on the north side, right? And I think that's something we can do. The other that people use, and you would see in Dave's redistricting map, is a precinct. And sometimes that precinct is a little bit larger than a census block group, right? And sometimes it's smaller. But those are determined by the counties. And those are really our blocks. What we're looking for is to follow those patterns as well. Also, your districts might not look immediately compact if you're following aspects of water, right? I think this is almost like the Oregon Trail, but if you have a river dividing part of the state, well, I'm not, again, from Oklahoma, so I don't know where all the bridges are, but it's one of those things where I need to make sure that if I'm going to represent a district, I have a bridge to get from one over to the other. But let's also make sure that our representatives aren't driving across bridges all the time. I mean, this is not a coastal community, right? So we can almost be north of the river, south of the river, if that makes sense. And then the other is our county boundaries, that they're not all squares, right? Some in Oklahoma are squares and rectangles, but others tend to have, right, almost a half circle at the top and then a square down at the south. And if you want to maintain the county as much as possible, you're going to follow that boundary first, right?
Sure.
Before you just go over and start taking from the next county over.
Right. And in Oklahoma, that's particularly important because after the state legislative redistricting and after the congressional redistricting is done this fall, it'll go to the counties where they will redistrict the county commissioner districts. And then down the road, when the county election boards start redrawing precincts, my understanding is they have to draw precincts that are wholly contained within a county commissioner district, a state legislative House district, a state Senate district, and the congressional district. And so knowing where these boundaries are makes a lot of sense. And because I think by and large, Oklahoma operates a lot at the county level. There's a lot of industry and a lot of kind of power consolidated at the county level. And so treating those lines as something important to follow makes a lot of sense. I remember us drawing the maps and talking about them recently, and we had them pulled up on our separate computers, and we were talking, and you made some comment about up near Tulsa how it looked odd because it sucks straight up. And I remembered from looking at these maps that's because those counties there go straight up, and then there's another narrow one on top that goes all the way to the Kansas border or nearly to it. And so you end up with districts that do seem, a bit long and narrow, but that's because that's how the county line goes right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and those are the ones to make sure that it didn't cross that many counties. I mean, once you said that, it made sense to me that if that district started to spread more east to west, right, then it was going to start representing more partial pieces of each county. And that's going to complicate some aspect here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and we talk about the county splitting, right? And I think built into Dave's redistricting is that measure of how many counties are split, right? And from what I've seen, the maps that we've drawn have much less splitting than the previous maps, the ones that we are currently operating under. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So in a sense, you think about this is that in a district, and this is important for the state Senate, each district needed to be about 81,000 people and change, right? And in the state House district, it needed to be 38,000, right? 38,800,
Yeah.
Again, almost 39,000. And obviously you have counties that are larger than that. The only county that ended up being perfect is Payne County. I don't know how, but it has exactly the point of population that you need to be less than 2.5% deviation from that ideal point. And we set that ideal point based off of what's the state population of Oklahoma, or in this case, the estimate from the 2019 American Community Survey in its last 5 years. And it estimates the state of Texas, and you divide it by 101, divide it by 48. So we have boundaries to stay within because the court says if you deviate beyond 5%, so you're lower than 2.5 or over 2.5, then that's too much. You have violated the equal protection clause, right, of one person, one vote. And so that's one of the ways, right, to look at this. And it's also, remember, when Andy and I were talking, we took a choice of making sure that we would make sure that we emphasize all of the individuals who reside in that district and not all of the people who are citizens and voters. right? It's very close, but it does mean in some cases that's going to fluctuate between some of the communities which have 80% are over the age of 18 and citizens, and some places where that population is only 48%, right? Because they're either a very young population or, right, they're a population that's new to Oklahoma. And so, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, when we look at those, there's some important questions to look at with how we make these choices. Also, this idea was if you have two cities that are on the county boundary, that becomes interesting, right? Are they culturally close or they absolutely separate, right? Where I live right now, Tyler, it's no secret, Longview, we are sister cities, we're very close. The high schools, huge rivalries, the newspapers, huge rivalries, right? If you put us in the same representative district, I think people would be upset. So typically, you might use that information and keep it separate. But the other thing that was really good for Andy and I were working on this was we made a choice to reduce splitting by focusing in on all of those 37 counties individually. So in Oklahoma County, we would draw as many districts that fit 38,000 in Oklahoma County without it bleeding over. And that left us with only 2 districts where a small part of the northwest corner of the Oklahoma County goes a little bit and is now represented by someone that represents Canadian County, right? The northern area of Canadian County now might represent 9,000 people or so at the very top of Oklahoma County. And then there was a part of the Northeast where I think it went to Kingfisher County or Logan County. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, and both of those make a lot of sense because, like, for people who are familiar with those parts of Oklahoma County, like I've lived in far northwest and also northeast Oklahoma County, and those have a lot of similarities to those areas in the next county, right? Like far northwest Oklahoma County is similar to Yukon and Piedmont in that area. There's a Walmart out there that's where a lot of people shop, and from that area. And the same thing up with far north Edmond, which people joke as being South Guthrie because the line at Waterloo Road that goes into the next county is kind of all the same area. Very different than 5 miles south where you're into, the heart of the city of Edmond there. So I think those decisions made a lot of sense to keep like communities, right? And to reflect the people who live there in a way that's accurate.
And as we come to those selections, what's almost funny is like the census block, the US Census knows to tell us what to look for. I mean, these census blocks get small and almost identical matching in the population where you think that you need to make that smoothing choice to get the population of one district to look like the other. I have no idea. Well, we were looking like, how do we find 1,000 people here? And it's like, oh, let's check this census block. That's where they are, right? I just need this one, not that one. And you could tell that in the past maps, the state legislature made those choices there as well, right? And that's why those blocks can be small. And I think it's good, at least one part to kind of go to another bigger story of ours is that we might have focused in on Oklahoma County first is the center of the state. And then in a radius part, if anything's going to go over, there are 2 ways to draw maps. You can draw it from the middle out, or you can draw it from the outside in. And that's really a problem, right? If you decide I'm going to draw the outside in and come in, so I'm going to start in the northwest corner of the state, fill in the districts going west to east, like I'm reading a book, you're going to find it harder to equalize the population in a county like Oklahoma County or Tulsa County, right? Because you're sort of still left with all the residual votes or people that you were trying to find representation from on the west as you're moving east.
And that's not there's a big divide or debate about a divide for urban versus rural people, interests, whatever. And this doesn't necessarily reflect that. It just reflects like, we know that there's going to be a lot of districts in Oklahoma County because of population density. Same thing applies in Tulsa County. And so it makes a lot of sense to get those knocked out first so that you've got that taken care of, because like you said, if you start in the panhandle and start moving across, every decision is like a domino that affects the next decision that affects the next decision. And before you know it, you've got like weird sprawling districts that don't make sense, right? They may not reflect the communities as you move across, much like a squall line in the springtime going across the state, right? With no concern for who's in the way. And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to note in this conversation that there's a lot to consider, and there's an important thing that we did not consider in this map drawing process, and that's where the incumbent legislators live, because we didn't want to pull that data, and because we believe, and this was part of our policy when we had our ballot initiative, was that these districts in most cases will be here way after whomever is in office today is gone, right? Like all of the leadership pretty much terms out in 2 years or 4 years. And so it makes no sense to draw districts based on where they live when it should be drawn about where just the people live. So we didn't even pull that data or mess with where it is. Now I kind of want to go back. Like there's a few that I know, like my state senator, because she lives down the street from me. And so I know that the district she serves in right now is in a different location in the new maps. That doesn't mean that she's without a district. She still will live in a district. It just will have a different number. And that's part of the deal, is that you run to represent the district in which you live. But when politicians are allowed to draw their own districts, they tend to draw them with an eye to keep themselves in office and to make sure that they have constituents that they've already built relationships with. And well, that makes sense. Again, in 2017, 2018, we had enormous turnover in the state legislature, where a big chunk termed out, a big chunk didn't run for re-election. Well, all of those people then, like, it doesn't matter, because it's someone else that's running for that seat that didn't have a say in how that district was drawn, and they might have done it differently. So that's one thing we didn't consider. Anything else that we intentionally didn't consider that's important to note?
Yeah, it's good to know that we didn't look at the vote shares, right? We just looked at where people live. And so the idea is I know there's an aspect of that when you think of fair maps that you want to consider the competitiveness angle, but right, we see that the Oklahoma Senate wanted to be explicit in that that's not part of their consideration. We wanted to give the most informed approach and sort of a proposal of maps there. So the idea is we're just looking at people and where they live. And then the next question was right after that, I guess, checking to make sure that we gave some of the racial representation after the fact, because you cannot draw the district first, right, to be race related, but you can check it afterwards and make the small adjustments. And this was good, right? The idea of looking county by county also matched the preferences of how the state house is setting up their committee, right? With lots of subcommittees, and you have a subcommittee for Oklahoma County, and you have a subcommittee for Tulsa County, but then also subcommittees for each of the regions. And so essentially by looking county by county, we're presenting something that's going to closely fit their plans and how they look to consider it. And so for that, yeah, I think it's good. The other where you mentioned, Andy, that's good to remember is that, past matters, that these are new estimates, and Oklahoma has changed in the last 10 years. So some of these districts in urban areas have to become smaller geographically, and areas that might be on the outer edges of the state need to grow, right, in order to catch more individuals. So it would be, in this case, I remember like Senate District 11 in our sort of plan opened up an opportunity, which was shifted some of the boundaries because that's where population grew. And that's where the population centers maybe made most sense to give us a more compact district. But if you compared that to the 2010 population, that district has now grown the way we would have proposed it, 17% of its population size, right? And that's just amazing to think of the comparison. Whereas before, like, how did that one person has a lot of new voters moving into their district? Obviously, they can't represent everyone they used to, but regardless of if we just reshuffled the whole maps, they were going to have a change in their constituency.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It was interesting, when we had our call kind of, and we went through county by county to look at the racial diversity of each district and comparing that. And then the point, I was honestly interested in like finding out, well, what's the partisanship of the lean of these districts look like? Because under our policy, that was a thing to consider, is that if you're trying to draw maps that are representative and fair, then there's an argument to be made that you should consider the voter identified partisanship of a district. Now there may be issues here with our two-party system and how it limits representation in other ways, because it doesn't always just because someone is unaffiliated or independent doesn't indicate how they lean or any of those things. But because the legislature in their rules for this year said we're not going to use that data, you can't consider it. We didn't put it in ours either, and so it was interesting to see how it stacks up and what that looks like compared to our current maps. As it turns out, our voter registration trends are probably no secret to anyone watching this at home. We've mapped it out over the last 20 years, and it's been a very steady decline for registrations of Democrats and a very steady increase for Republicans, and I think that's reflected in the last several elections at the state legislature. Mark, another 5 or 10 minutes so before we do questions. Anything else that you want to highlight?
Well, I was trying to think. No, the other parts of knowing that, yeah, the competitiveness was there. I guess I wondered, do you want to play the good, the bad, and the ugly game?
Yeah, let's do that.
I think this will be kind of fun. So one of the things that's really good for us is to remember, right, we talk about, well, how does your district look? This is sort of the first face validity check. Is you're kind of wondering, well, why does this district sort of jet out to get that community? And so I think one of the things that is there is just to remind you that when we talk about this, shifting any district is exactly like, as Andy had almost described before, when you pull one domino, it's going to go in an entire circle. That means it affects north, west, south, right, all at the same time. And if you decide to draw in and then come out, it's almost like you have to think of where the domino is going to end somewhere. And I would think in this case, the southwest, right, has Lawton throws up some interesting trends. Lawton needs to have its own district, right? And how does that affect, again, the district which there's so many people that live there that it can't connect all the way down to the border, and it can't go necessarily much further east. So I'll get to that one later of how that sort of meant that we did split, and I think understandably why, right? Caddo County or Grady County, only in a tall, medium, like middle and southern category, each kind of very similar. But on our good way, right, and looking at this population deviation, I think that the Senate District 44 in Oklahoma County ends up being a great example of what that fairest district could be. So essentially, by picking on these census block groups, which is important because that was the lowest level of really quality data that we had, we almost picked exactly 0 deviation, right? That ideal point was down by less than 0.1%. It's competitive without us trying, right? And it shows that there's a potential for there to be minority influence, but it's not clear which, right? So in this case, the white registered voter or white voting age population is about 55% there. But I think actually, if we look back at it of all population, it was like 51%. It's just representative of when you think whoever represents that community is going to be in touch with a lot of people, right? And they're going to be accountable to a lot of people, but also it's reflective of where the state trends are. And I'd mentioned before, I guess Payne County, that one was just like, click the county, make the district, you're good. The bad one, which was kind of interesting, was, nothing can be perfect. So it was districts 26 or 38, right, overlap Lawton a little bit because Lawton needs to have its own space, but the rest of the area around it can be so rural So it doesn't look like a great square because you have to somehow give Lawton its representation, and something has to go above it and something has to go below it. And then they extend out to the west. And so I think overall, right, the other one was in the House district category, those deviations appear a little larger than, necessarily where the Senate, we could get down to less than like 0.5%. But, the huge one there was your denominator, right, is half. So the percentages look a little larger. And I think that's that one part that we miss when we focus in on percentages, is that the deviation per district by people was actually less. But it looks larger when we show you a percentage. But one of them, I think I maybe alluded to before, was like Beckham. In Beckham County, it's just the growth of those other districts sort of all pinches right on it. And so the other later one was in that southern category, District 65. I would say House District 65, as we would have drawn it in Andy's map, has the largest deviation, right? 2.45. And I would have, I think in this case, we were really kicking around about that. How do we make it smaller, right? And the transition was from that, it was, and to me, I think it looks like Woodstock from Charlie Brown. Like it just literally has a tail and a head and a beak, but it covers the counties, right? It's wholly Cotton County. It's that lower half of Comanche County, right? And it picks up what you need from Caddo because Caddo deserves multiple districts. And so, and then takes in some Grady. So all of a sudden, when we said we want to reduce splitting, but we still want it to look compact, that's what the district had to look like. And also that's where and if you did that without cutting over another county needlessly just to take 50 people from over here, that deviation just looks a little bit bigger. But it's within the legal reason, right? It emphasizes the counties. And so it's completely justifiable before a judge. In this case, if you're saying, well, why isn't this 0, right? You made the county argument. And so those are the kind of fun things that you go back and forth, right? You see something made on map and you're like, how do I make it better? And you tool around with it and you're like, it can't be better, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably important for viewers to know that based on the population estimates, like Oklahoma County as one example, it's estimated to have gained 80,000 or 81,000 people over the last 10 years, which is an entire state Senate district, right? And 2 House districts. And that means that those have to come from somewhere. And we don't just pick them up and move them. But when you start there, it means you got to draw all of these. And that means the ones around it in the suburbs are slightly bigger. And then they get, bigger as they get into more rural areas. And at some point, all the land is covered by districts. But that means that a district that might have appeared to have existed somewhere doesn't exist there anymore because that area lost enough that, as a piece of that territory was reallocated to the districts around it, then it just got shuffled that way. And I think that's, in terms of people, I think just general understanding of the population trends in Oklahoma, to know that it was substantial enough in Oklahoma County that it needed that big of a chunk. Tulsa County, I think, gained 47,000 people. And so another House district and, and a big chunk of a Senate district into that county. And so just knowing that those things are happening, it does have that ripple effect across the state. Yeah.
And I think the good reason as well with what Andy said of seeing ripples is to know that you come back and have the group and collaborative meetings. Like the best thing that the independent commission can do in public comments is to almost let people know that the last draft isn't done yet. So even if we thought that, man, all of that population trends that we had sort of tended to land in the Southwest Oklahoma part, then that meant that we just take a couple more hours and focus in on Southwest Oklahoma as if it was its own state, right? And iron out those wrinkles. And then all of a sudden you have compact districts that match something.
Right.
Now, maybe those counties look a little bit more split maybe than they needed to, but that's because now they reflect the cities that are there and the cultural similarities going east to west, right? If a county tends to be more north and south. So those are really some great things that you can think of doing, is to remember that while know where these remainders can go, and then check the lines again, because
Right.
none of it's really permanent until you've locked all of the districts to as the approved level, because you think that's the lowest deviation you can have.
Yeah. Well, let's take some questions. And Beth, I'm gonna have you go first. I think Beth's got a question here on the line, as they say.
Yeah. My question is about partisan representation, where I do understand that the legislature says that they're not going to factor that in, but as you guys were talking about earlier, it is a factor, and it is important because so many of our processes boil down to which party you're in. So currently in our legislature, both houses are about 20% Democrat and 80% Republican. And I meant to look up your maps again before tonight, but if I remember right, the percentages are roughly the same, even though the registered voters in our state currently are about 35% Democratic and almost 50% Republican. We have a pretty good chunk of 15% independent. So like, assuming all of those independent voters actually vote Republican, like as a bare minimum, it just seems like there should be a higher percentage of representation for Democrats. It's coming in at, about 15% short. So like, I understand wanting to keep some areas together, but it seems like you can't ignore that. Otherwise, aren't you just packing those voters in?
Can I have it the answer, and then I want
Yeah.
to correct me? So my suspicion, and I'll let Mark give the official answer, but it's that people don't live in boxes necessarily according to their their affiliation. So there are districts primarily in the metro areas that have more Democrats, but there's also a lot of Democrats that are just sprinkled around the state, right? And so if there are 5,000 Democrats in a district of 80,000 people, that it shows up on the statewide voter stats, but in that district they don't stand a chance in winning a race because they are overwhelmed. And we saw this with some of the Medicaid expansion and medical marijuana. Like, you saw these pockets of precincts that voted, and if you colored them blue, if you even look at gubernatorial elections, you can kind of see where there are pockets of Democrats, but not enough to swing a whole district. Mark, is that anywhere near correct?
Yeah, I think that's where we was trying to think of this. If you particularly went after and tried to maximize representation, it would be by doing it in splitting cities that would be in Garfield County or in Comanche County, right? So that would have been, instead of giving a city its whole district, it would be almost cutting the cities in half and then giving them additional rural districts. And I think that starts to move towards the thought of, right, particularly gerrymandering practices, or right, because you're cracking one community. So I think in this case, what we would try and do is, when you have the variation in places like Oklahoma County, and you can fit a lot of districts there, right? That moves into some of the diversity that you could have, right? That all of a sudden, it's to say, I think it's District 44 does keep in. It's one of our districts, which is there weren't enough to have a majority minority, say Hispanic district, but there are a lot of Hispanics in that district, and it also goes to the the southeast corner end of Oklahoma County. And so that, yeah.
I also think, this is one of those things that would undoubtedly be different, right? If it was different people drawing the map. So if this was an independent commission, like we had proposed, where it's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 3 neither, those 9 people would almost certainly make some different decisions than we would. And if those 9 people in a particular year decided that partisan competitiveness was a priority for them within the confines of how the law was written, then you might see a slightly different shift. But I think the fact that we drew the districts and then, like, several days later went back and looked at it, and the percentage was almost identical to what it is right now, like, bespeaks like this is probably how it is. And so that was somewhat, a lot of my Democrat friends like hope there's some kind of sneaky way to draw the maps that would get them an edge. And honestly, I mean, from looking at it a lot over the last couple of weeks and thinking about how to gerrymander districts in favor of one party or the other, because it's such a steep one party control, like if you did try to gerrymander them in a way that is the most favorable to Democrats, you would have the districts that are now blue would be slightly less blue to split those people off into districts, and you would end up with like a lot of purplish ones, of which they would likely lose some and maybe gain some others, and then they wouldn't have a net gain.
And Andy, I want to add one more part to Beth's question, is that the comparison of multiple maps. So in this case, by tomorrow, you present more than just Andy's presenting these maps, you're going to see differences. But I think the Dave's redistricting map had examples which said this is the most competitive you could be. And their map, which was drawn explicitly to have as many Democrats as you could in a district and as the best representation for Republicans, was then 12% competitive. So that was 1% more than us. And they were drawing districts without consideration of keeping a county together in that way in order to get the partisan outcome.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our next question is from Doris from the League down in Norman. Doris asks, what are the current maps' weaknesses? So I assume like the maps that were drawn 10 years ago that we are living in right now. Is there any evidence of gerrymandering in those maps?
Yeah. Wait, Annie, I want to hear more. Let's go and talk about that one district that totally got eliminated because it involved three counties, right? This is the state Senate silhouette. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. So Doris, I'll answer your question as best I can. With anything, quote, evidence of gerrymandering is somewhat subjective, right? Like there's a number of statistical measures by which you could assess, but you have to kind of assess it on certain grounds. Like, was the district drawn to benefit any particular group, a party, or race or ethnic group, or to disadvantage a group? This is more often the case, and so that's difficult to say. When we put out that report a couple of months ago that looked at all of our state legislative districts and found that in many ways they are gerrymandered, particularly from the perspective of protecting incumbent legislators, right? Like districts would not be drawn the way they are if it wasn't because of where the incumbents lived at the time they were drawn 10 years ago. They were drawn to, keep people in their district, like whatever the number is, right? If you're like District 25 and you're like, that's my district, I live in it. Well, suddenly, because the redrawing process moved the boundaries around, District 25 used to swirl this way, and now it's moved this way, but the person lives here, and so they're still in the district, even though the people are totally different, right? And so those kinds of decisions, I would argue, is some evidence of gerrymandering. Another thing that is, I think to many people regarded as gerrymandering is how Oklahoma counts prison populations. Now, we didn't factor this into our maps this year because it was not part of, because the rules from the legislature instructed us to do it the way that they do it, and that is they count inmates at correctional facilities where they live, not at their home address. So if someone, by and large, most of the people that are incarcerated are from one of the metro areas, and most of the facilities are in rural areas, and so it reallocates those people, right, based on their placement. Under our policy, that was not going to be the way it was. If someone had an Oklahoma address, the time they were incarcerated, they were to be counted where they lived. Now, whether or not that would sway any districts, I don't think, but just on a, we look at fairness on the macro level and also on the micro level of like, how does this, if this person's family is located at this other zip code and this other address, why are we counting them all the way over here? So that's how I'll answer that. But Mark, chime in if you've got other thoughts.
Yeah, I think that there's good answers. The other ones that we tend to look at would be what can be called like an efficiency gap, right? So what's the percentage of votes that a Democrat gets in a statewide election, and what are the percentage of the seats in that legislature that they receive? Now that's more like an outcome. That's sort of this, that's the data test for whether you should look into partisan gerrymandering. And that was where last year the Supreme Court said, right, even a state like Maryland was in trouble for that because they had actually elected too many Democrats, right? And so there was this move back to those. But it's interesting, right? In this case of the gerrymandering, making sure that you don't make choices that are explicitly trying to get one group. And I think people are getting good at this in the thought of not always saying what they're trying to do. That was what I remember in Georgia, the history was they called their title Max Black, right? And then they said, well, this wasn't really driven by race. And you're like, well, that's the problem, right? And those are the 90s. But this idea of the gerrymandering does come into, who's involved. And this is why it's really important, even if the numbers aren't equal, that Oklahoma Democrats are on the redistricting committees, because that way the maps aren't being drawn, right, without your representation of any voter. And so I really, as an outsider, I'm a little bit, or in this case, a Texan, kind of envious of this subcommittee of everybody in the Oklahoma House side, right? That, in Texas, where my state senator is on the redistricting committee, but that doesn't mean that I'm getting a lot of updates, right? The same way that you all are being able to participate as citizens, right, is really kind of unique.
That's funny, Mark. I don't know if I told you this, but one of the members of the House redistricting committee, so there's all the subcommittees, and each of the subcommittees have a chair, and then they sit on the House committee. But one of those members submitted a map for the House. I noticed on all the submissions are posted on the website that his was on there, Representative Mark Lawson. And so I look forward to hearing his report tomorrow on how he's been super into this and asked a ton of good questions in the meetings. And so I'm interested to see how someone that's on the committee was like, I'm going to send my own map just to kind of go through it. So that I think is kind of cool. We have another question here from Lynn that asks us to please discuss the recent Supreme Court decisions. I'm assuming, Lynn, that you're referring to the decisions in 2019. And Mark, forgive me, I've forgotten the case name, but I know you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so I guess they're the two that I was interested in. One was the fact that, in the Maryland case was almost making sure, again, that you could bring cases on partisan gerrymandering. In the past, right, it's not so much that those had ever been overturned, but this idea now that you can prove it, and sometimes you have to go back. But the one thing that was good, and Andy and I talked about this with our why look county by county, is that the other case that was involving Texas and really kind of focused in on the representation of Latino voters south of Fort Worth going towards Austin was the idea that all of these concerns need to be addressed district by district. And so actually when we come through on this, the importance of a map is now not just how the map looks overall, but if you can prove that in this county, you can have a better distribution of districts, right? And you can then prove that this would be how that community, again, within these boundaries, can be represented. So that gives you a choice now that it's really brought on the burden of who might bring forward a case, right? You have to prove it now district by district. But also, as Andy said, if you find that one district happens to be discriminatory towards a group, that's going to actually affect the 4 districts around it, right? Because those lines all have to be adjusted.
Yeah. On a related note, I think our viewers might be interested to hear a little explanation in brief of Thornburg versus Gingles, because that's an important thing that factors into all of this.
It does. And I think this is almost even related to if it was a case in Wisconsin, but the thought is, you have these questions of what's fair. And although, right, we do joke sometimes as political scientists that like data, when Judge Roberts told us that, or Justice Roberts, that, data didn't matter. He wasn't going to be swayed. He'd be swayed by precedent, right? But the Thornburg v. Gingles gives you 3 prongs of a test to determine whether or not there is a problem or there's the outcome of racial gerrymandering. And this is one, can you prove that any one group, constituency of interest, is large enough to have its own representation in a district? So do they live close enough? And is that large enough? Are they the same group? Second, you have to find out, do they vote the same way? Because then there's the opportunity, right, that one group, we may look the same, but we vote differently, right? We have socioeconomic differences or however those work in politics. So just because you look the same doesn't mean you always get the same representation. So this helps us bridge I think that's representation of our demographics and representation of our ideology. But the third is, though, if you are large enough and if you vote the same way and your candidate that group votes for consistently loses because maybe they're drawn at 50-50, then that is a problem, right? So that was sometimes is the case, is that, you wanted to then the argument is, well, are people receiving less representation, right? If you can show that, well, this person happens to, their representative walks the great line, right, of representing all groups, then this isn't discrimination, right? But in a sense, if the representative is giving favoritism towards one group, and that would not be the group that could be protected under the law, right, that ends up being another case where you would change the district.
And all of that is like one of the reasons that in drawing maps, you look at total population as well as just the voting age population, because as we said earlier, you might look at a given district and sure, on the whole, like there's 80,000 people there, and we think that they skew this one direction. But when you look at the voting age population, you realize, only that district has a bunch of minors or children, right? And so there's only 40,000 people that can actually vote in that district. Well, then it changes what representation looks like for everybody else.
Yeah, and the Thornburg v. Gingles case came out in 1983, but it sort of follows along the same pattern of those 1965 tests that were there, right? Because if less than half of your eligible voting age population is registered to vote, then that's a concern. So we know that Shelby County versus Holder said that old 1965 test can't apply, but that doesn't mean that the Thornburg v. Gingles test doesn't still apply, right? That's the 1983 updated version. It's just sort of how do you structure your question?
This is fascinating. This makes me want to go to law school all over again. When I promised my wife I wouldn't go to grad school again until I paid off my loans from the last couple of degrees. So that'll be it. I think that wraps up all of our questions for tonight. Mark, thank you so much for being here. This has been fun.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. Beth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I'll just close it out. That was a really interesting discussion, going into the weeds a little bit with Andy and Mark. So we appreciate that. Thank everyone for attending this evening. And if you want to learn more about redistricting, you can go to fairmapsok.org or the League's website, lwvok.org. So we thank everyone for coming. Enjoy your evening.